Hello everyone and welcome to this week 3 final week roundup of our online course. I'm Kim Simpson. You've been seeing me on some of the videos on this course and it's been a real pleasure this week to dip into some of your wonderful and insightful discussions. I do hope that you've enjoyed the last 3 weeks and I know that I speak for my colleagues Gillian, Alistair and Alison in saying that we certainly have. So thank you for engaging with the course in your comments and for some wonderful conversation as well. Indeed, I'm sad that I haven't been able this time to engage with the run as much as I would have liked. This is the second run of the course, which we designed a few years ago, that has taken place since the start of the coronavirus pandemic, which for many of us I think has meant considerable changes to our daily lives, whether this has been illness or self-isolating, social distancing, caring for children at home in my case, or indeed for frontline workers caring for others in schools and in hospitals. It's been heartening to hear from many of you that this course has cheered you or provided solace in these uncertain, unsettling times. This isn't the first time that Jane Austen has been used for comfort and for solace in this way, of course. She's often deployed by readers in times of adversity. And this week, thinking about adaptations, I think this question of comfort actually has loomed really large. So there are some adaptations, the 1995 Pride and Prejudice in particular, which seem like comfortable old friends. They're faithful, they're pleasant, they're ways to escape the trials of the modern day, to step into Austen's world. And then there are other adaptations, like the recent Sanditon, for example, which provoke an entirely different response. Often they provoke discomfort, to some they seem unfamiliar, offensive, opportunistic, or just not Austen. But before I come on and talk a little bit about the content of this week, I want to briefly draw your attention to what I've been working on over at Chawton House. And this is partly a kind of shameless plug on my part, but also partly to give you somewhere to go after this course is over. So since the lockdown happened in the UK, Chawton House has implemented a really ambitious digital programme, and one that I do hope you as either long-term lovers or as recent converts to Jane Austen and her contemporaries will be able to enjoy. So I'm filming this on Friday the 10th of July. Tomorrow, on Saturday the 11th of July, the Jane Austen Society in the UK celebrate their 80th birthday. And for this, Chawton House is putting on a series of online talks that you can see by visiting the website. One of these talks is by Emma Cleary, who featured on this course in week 2. We've also at Chawton launched a summer series of Jane Austen related talks. So the scholar Janet Todd started us off, and she talked about the connections between Jane Austen's first completed novel, Northanger Abbey, and her final incomplete one, Sanditon. Over the next month, I'll be speaking to Janice Hadlow, who is the author of The Other Bennet Sister, and also to two playwrights based in the States, Sarah Rose Kearns and Nandita Shenoy, who've both staged adaptations of Austen's novels, and so they're going to be talking about their practice. So if you enjoyed the discussions this week about adaptation, then I think these talks will be of particular interest to you. There was also a lockdown literary festival back in mid-May, and the talks from that are still on the Chawton House YouTube channel. So you can see Gillian Dow, you can see me, you can see Alison Daniel as well, and lots of others, Austen scholars, novelists, poets and journalists as well. So I do hope that as we kind of emerge out of lockdown, you still find that there's plenty of material to keep engaging with. After this weekend, we won't be moderating the comments on the message boards anymore, but they will stay open. So do keep the discussions going with one another. I know that some of you are kind of catching up. Some of you are still kind of back on week 1 at the moment. And I think it's wonderful to be able to tap into this sort of community, particularly during a time like this, to find like-minded people. So to the roundup, then, it's quite difficult, I think, to do justice to the range and the breadth of conversation that you've been having this week. It's a week where we've thought about Austen's afterlives, about translation, and adaptation. Um, One of the things that I hope is really clear is that Austen is far from an author who is limited to her particular geographical location. She talks, of course, about 3 or 4 families in a country village being the very thing to work on, to write about. But her novels, of course, hint at a world outside this country village, even if they don't actually venture there. So I'm thinking of Sir Thomas's Antiguan plantation in Mansfield Park, but this is just one of several examples. The course itself is called Myth, Reality and Global Celebrity. And indeed, one of these myths that we wanted to disrupt, I guess, is the idea that Austen is somehow confined to her small corner of Hampshire, England. Of course, in her lifetime, she didn't leave England, although she did spend some time in seaside resorts. She spent time in London with her brother Henry, and she lived a kind of peripatetic lifestyle before settling in Chawton, although that was within Hampshire. But her novels were, as Gillian has outlined in her section, translated into French shortly after their publication. And then after her life, she becomes global. And we know this from modern adaptations, UK adaptations, American adaptations, but also things like the Bollywood movie Bride and Prejudice. And we also know it from the worldwide Jane Austen societies. So we have them in English-speaking countries, America, Australia, but also in Japan, Mexico, in Argentina, Brazil, Pakistan, India, Spain, Italy, Denmark. These are just some examples. So we can see that Austen has this kind of continuing and widespread fame. Another myth, or rather an idea about Austen that we wanted to challenge, was that she was not political. And there's a lively and continuing debate about the exact nature of her politics, of course, with foundational critics like Marilyn Butler, who wrote Jane Austen and the War of Ideas, arguing that Austen was a very conservative writer, whilst others more recently try and unpack what they see as Austen's kind of secret radicalism. And one strand of this consideration of Austen's politics is to do with her feminism. We're told the personal is political, and feminism, women's issues are, of course, also issues of politics. Many of you have quite rightly pointed out in discussions the dangers of what we call presentism in reading Austen, so of wanting too much for her values to align with our own. And indeed, I think an awareness of how keen we have been to find feminist heroines in Austen, and to locate feminism in all of the women writers that we read actually from this period, is now leading to an interest in characters that we might have overlooked because of that. So characters from Austen's life and work, sisters in particular that don't necessarily conform to what we might call the sort of Lizzie Bennet outlook, women that aren't definite feminists, women that don't sparkle and charm. And indeed, the discussions about Fanny Price this week tap into this interest, I think. As do 2 recent adaptations, both of which I very much enjoyed, actually. So both are novels. They came out in January 2020. Jill Hornby's book, Miss Austen, has Jane's sister Cassandra and her decision to destroy Jane's letters at its heart. And I really enjoyed reading the week 2 discussion on the ethics of this decision. And the other is Janice Hadlow's response to Pride and Prejudice, which casts the derided Mary Bennet as its heroine. This is called The Other Bennet Sister. But to return to the politics then, some of you have suggested that Austen perhaps felt muzzled or unable to address overtly the issue of slavery. And in response to that, I just wanted to draw your attention to some of Austen's predecessors and her contemporaries, to say that many women were in fact deeply engaged with the abolition movement, which has a real kind of peak in the 1790s prior to the French Revolution. So women are engaging with questions of abolition, and they're kind of peculiarly suited as women to do so. So it becomes a way in which women can legitimately enter into the public sphere without kind of drawing shame or derision from others. So many of the early campaigners for abolition were dissenting men, particularly Quakers, but women were also very active. So Anna Letitia Barbauld was a Unitarian, Hannah More was an evangelist, Amelia Opie became a Quaker later in her life. And within this dissenting tradition, women were treated with relative equity. They were often given fairly comprehensive educations. And so many of the female romantic poets of the time came from these dissenting backgrounds. In addition to having religiously inflected sympathies towards the oppressed, women were, as I've said, peculiarly suited to writing about slavery because of what society saw as their inherent capacity for fine feeling, so that their sensibility, their tendency towards sympathy. Slavery then was very much not a topic that women were always silent on. And indeed, lots of early feminist writing aligned the positions of women and slaves in ways that are rather uncomfortable today, but perhaps that made more sense for women who felt acutely the coverture and primogeniture laws that saw them treated as property without the status of full legal person. So this is something that we thought a little bit about in week 2. So the question then is might we see Fanny Price as someone unhappily imported from elsewhere and set to work on the property of a plantation owner, albeit the English property? Might we see this as Jane Austen's response to the alignments made by her female contemporaries between women and slaves? If you're interested in reading more about how women writers engaged with the slave trade, Moira Ferguson's book Subject to Others is a really good place to start. And there was also a fascinating BBC documentary by David Olusoga called Britain's Forgotten Slave Owners, which I recommend too for a wider picture of slave owning in Britain at the time. Austen herself, as many of you have kind of noted in the comments in our discussions about Mansfield Park, was proximate to the slave trade in several ways. So she had 2 brothers in the Navy who saw it firsthand. Her brother Frank was the only brother to officially denounce slavery, but her younger brother Charles was also involved in intercepting slave ships during his naval career. Jane's aunt, Lee Perrott, was born in Barbados, where she had a plantation. Her own father, the Reverend George Austen, also served as a trustee for an Antiguan estate, which was owned, a plantation which was owned by his good friend James Nibbs. But by the same token, George Austen and Jane Austen enjoyed anti-slavery literature. So along with her character Marianne in Sense and Sensibility, Austen was fond of William Cooper, who was a very outspoken abolitionist. And she also, we know, read Thomas Clarkson's History of Abolition, which came out the year after the 1807 Slave Act, which made the trade illegal but not the plantations themselves. So all of this is to give you some backdrop. It's not to say that Mansfield Park is or should be a novel about slavery, but rather to suggest that Austen was not writing in a vacuum. And if you read something like Janine Barkis's Matters of Fact in Jane Austen, you'll know that Austen rarely did anything, including selecting names by accident. So I think it's no accident that Mrs. Norris shares her name with a well-known slaver, John Norris, who's described in Clarkson's book. By the same token, in Northanger Abbey, a conversation is described and then ended by Austen, writing, "From politics it was an easy step to silence." And so perhaps this dead silence that we find in Mansfield Park says more about what it is and isn't polite to speak about in company than anything else. Okay, so to adaptation then, I've really enjoyed reading your thoughts about the many and varied adaptations of Austen. I had no idea that there were Austen musicals, and I'm looking forward to getting stuck into some of those as and when it becomes possible. I found this distinction between based on and inspired by a really helpful one when thinking about the various ways that adaptations respond to Austen. And kind of leading on from that, I also think it's worth thinking of Austen herself as someone who was very comfortable with the practice of parody from a very young age. This itself is a kind of form of adaptation. So I'm thinking about Northanger Abbey, of course, but also about a work that she wrote as a teenager in 1791 called The History of England. And this work, which Cassandra illustrated, pokes fun at history textbooks like Oliver Goldsmith's History of England, which was published in the late 1770s. And she signs this piece off as a partial, prejudiced and ignorant historian. So I'd really recommend looking at this if you want to kind of get a fuller picture of Austen's own practices of adaptation, of parody, of engagement with what's gone before. Her tone is gently mocking, it's irreverent, and I think that perhaps suggests that she might not have minded that some of our modern adaptations aren't entirely serious. So I'm thinking specifically of the improv comedy group Ostentatious, who rewrite Austen's novels according to audience suggestions, and the titles that come out of it always make me laugh. Mansfield Shark is one, and Strictly Come Darcy is another. So Austen often, I think, kind of straddles the academic and the popular world, and this is something that can make people very uncomfortable. So you get Austen transfer tattoos and Austen toothpaste and Austen gin, and these sort of pieces of merchandise seem degraded when placed alongside her actual novels, her works of genius. And indeed, one of the participants this week noted that this term celebrity itself implies superficiality. It implies a sort of contrast to the idea of genius. So I know that we sort of talked about this a little bit at the end of week 2. The development of celebrity as we know it is really kind of getting off the ground during Austen's lifetime. So we have these scandalous figures like Byron or Mary Robinson who draw public interest. But I think the kind of fascination with texts and trends and the kind of marketisation of them begins earlier. So Samuel Richardson, who's a writer that we're told Austen very much enjoyed, published his first novel, Pamela. He publishes this in 1740, and it generates this massive media response. So there are sequels, and there are plays and operas, adaptations, poems, discussions about it in newspapers. There were paintings on display and murals in the Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. You could buy fans with prints on them from the novel, tea sets, playing cards. There are even waxworks. So Pamela generates what is talked about by scholars as a kind of media vogue. So this is all to say that the connections then between adaptation, merchandise and marketing are all being established before Austen's time. And you know, some of them are scholarly and properly engaged with the cortex, and other ones are just to sell merchandise. These practices are nothing new, and were going on in the 18th century. So I'm going to draw things to a close here, just by saying that I hope that the current crisis in the arts and heritage that's been brought about by this horrible pandemic will be resolved and will give us access once again to the kind of incredible creativity and the fun, I think, to be found in adaptations of Austen's life and works, as well as in the originals themselves. I was happy to be able to see the most recent version of Emma from my living room in the early days of lockdown, and not so happy in having my tickets to Laura Wade's adaptation of The Watsons on stage at the Harold Pinter Theatre cancelled. And I do hope that, you know, eventually we will be able to come back to these responses to Austen, and that new responses will continue to be generated. So the very final thing I'd like to say is a big thank you to someone who's been absolutely integral to the running of this course since it began in 2018, and that's Alison Daniel. This was sadly Alison's last run of the MOOC as she finishes off her PhD, and I'm sure that you'll all agree that she's been a wonderful and really engaging mentor, and she's certainly been a wonderful colleague to work with on this project. So thank you to Alison, and also a huge thank you to all of you for being with us over these last 3 weeks. I hope you've enjoyed the course. I hope it's given you an insight into Jane Austen and Jane Austen's works. And I hope that you have something that you can take away and return to Jane Austen's novels with. So take care and stay safe. Goodbye.